The night settles over the room slowly, the way it always does when a good story is about to begin. Somewhere outside the world is doing whatever the world does at this hour, and none of it matters now. What matters is this. Pull the blanket up. Let your eyes close if they want to. I am going to tell you something true, something that shaped every meal you have ever eaten, without you ever once thinking about it. For nearly the entire span of human existence, food was a countdown. The moment an animal died, the moment a fruit was picked, the moment a fish was pulled gasping from a river, decay began its quiet work, and there was almost nothing anyone could do to stop it. A single bad season, a single failed hunt, a single storage pit gone soft with rot could mean the difference between a family that survives the winter and a family that does not. This is the story of that razor's edge, and of the astonishing centuries-long struggle to hold it back. Picture a woman standing at the mouth of a shallow cave in what is now Central Europe, somewhere near the end of the last ice age. It is early autumn, and behind her, laid out on a bed of dry moss, is the meat from a reindeer her people brought down 3 days ago. She kneels beside it now, running her fingers along the surface of a haunch, checking for the telltale sheen and smell that means the meat has turned. Some of it has. She sets that portion aside, food for tonight, before it becomes food for no one. The rest she works with practiced hands, slicing it into long even strips, draping them over a frame of green branches above a low-smoking fire that her brother tends without needing to be told. This is not decoration. This is not tradition for its own sake. This is arithmetic. Every strip that dries successfully is a day her children will eat in the deep cold of midwinter, when the ground is frozen too hard to dig and the animals have scattered or gone still in their dens. Every strip that moulds or rots before it is ready is a day they will not. She does not know the word for bacteria. She does not need it. She knows in the way that generations of watching and losing teaches a person that meat left in the open air begins to betray you within a day, sometimes less, and that the fire and the smoke and the careful watching are the only shield her family has against a hunger that waits just beyond the tree line. What strikes historians and archaeologists most when they reconstruct scenes like this one is not the danger itself, but the sheer relentless skill required to survive it. Long before anyone could read or write, human beings became master chemists of decay without ever knowing they were chemists at all. They learned through trial and through loss which plants could poison a stockpile of grain if the harvest came in wet. They learned that salt drew the life out of meat and left it inhospitable to rot. They learned that smoke did something to flesh that fire alone could not. None of it was written down. All of it was carried forward the only way it could be, in memory, in habit, in the quiet correction. A parent gives a child who has packed the storage pit wrong. And for tens of thousands of years, this fragile inherited knowledge was the only wall standing between a community and starvation. What almost nobody realizes today is how deeply this single problem, the simple stubborn fact that food does not want to stay food-shaped, nearly every major turn in early human history. It shaped where people chose to settle and how far they dared to wander from a reliable water source. It shaped the earliest religious rituals, many of which centered on harvest and preservation and the terror of an empty granary. Scholars still debate exactly how much of early human migration was driven by the search for better preservation conditions rather than simply better hunting grounds, but the evidence increasingly suggests that the two were almost impossible to separate. A cave with a cool, dry back chamber was not just shelter. It was a refrigerator thousands of years before anyone had a word for the concept, and the difference between a good cave and a bad one could be the difference between a community that lasted 5 generations and one that vanished after 2. Before we go further into that story, and into just how close entire civilizations came to losing everything over something as ordinary as spoiled grain, I want to ask you for something small. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, quiet, honest, and told without any rush to shock you, take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who might need it tonight. And if you feel like it, leave a comment letting me know where you are listening from and what drew you to this particular story. I read everyone and I love knowing who is out there in the dark with me, so now get comfortable, let's begin. That woman at the cave mouth working meat into strips against a coming winter, she could feel in the colour of the light and the shortening of the days was not unusual. She was in a very real sense almost every human being who has ever lived, for the overwhelming majority of our species' time on this earth. The question was never what to eat in some abstract philosophical sense. It was how to make what you had last long enough to matter. It was how to outwit mold insects, bacteria, and time itself using nothing but salt smoke, sun, cold, and an accumulated inheritance of trial and error passed from hand to hand across centuries. This was not a background detail of ancient life. It was in many ways the whole of it. The rise and fall of settlements, the migrations that reshaped continents, the earliest hierarchies of power built around who controlled the grain stores, all of it traces back to this same unglamorous, unrelenting truth. Food rotted, and human beings had to become extraordinary in ways we rarely give them credit for simply to keep eating. That story, the long and largely untold history of humanity's war against spoilage and the astonishing cost it exacted in lives in empires and in ordinary winters that turned suddenly and quietly fatal, is where we are headed now. Consider what it actually meant to live by a calendar, written not in numbers but in the behaviour of animals and the colour of leaves. Long before agriculture gave human beings the illusion of control over their food supply, entire communities organised their lives around a rhythm that swung season by season between genuine abundance and genuine want. This rhythm was not a metaphor. It was biology written directly onto the human body. In late summer, along the coastlines of what is now the Pacific Northwest, the rivers filled with salmon in numbers that are almost impossible to picture today. Historical and archaeological accounts describe runs so dense that a person could in theory walk across certain narrow channels on the backs of the fish alone. For the peoples who lived along these waterways, this was the single most important window of the entire year, and it demanded an almost superhuman coordination. Every able hand turned toward the river. Fish were caught, gutted, and split within hours, then hung to dry over slow fires or laid across wooden racks in the sun, because a fish left whole for even a single day in the warmth of early autumn would spoil before it could be eaten. The abundance was real, but it was also fleeting, and it carried its own quiet terror. If the smoking racks failed, if rain came at the wrong moment and softened the drying flesh into rot, if the community simply could not process fish fast enough before the run thinned and vanished downstream. The difference would not be felt in that moment. It would be felt in February, in the coldest, hungriest weeks of winter, when the stores that should have been full were instead half empty, and there was no second chance coming until the following year. This is the part of ancient life that is easy to romanticize and hard to actually feel from a distance of thousands of years. We tend to imagine early human communities as living in a kind of eternal present, taking what nature offered and being grateful for it. The reality was closer to a year-long negotiation with catastrophe. A summer of true abundance did not simply mean a summer of plenty. It meant a desperate, physically exhausting sprint to convert that abundance into something that could survive the months when nothing at all was growing or running or migrating nearby. Anthropologists who study the skeletal remains of hunter-gatherer populations from this era often find a telling pattern in the bones themselves. Faint lines of arrested growth formed during periods when a child's body simply didn't have enough to build itself properly. These lines, sometimes called growth arrest lines, are a kind of biological diary, and in many excavated remains they appear with a seasonal regularity that lines up almost perfectly with the lean months before spring. The body remembers hunger even when no written record does. What makes this rhythm even more striking is how differently it played out depending on where in the world a community happened to live and how narrow the margin for error truly was. In the high latitudes of northern Europe, reindeer herds moved in vast seasonal migrations, and communities that depended on them had perhaps a few short weeks each year to intercept the herd kill, enough animals to last through 8 or 9 months of scarcity, and preserve every usable part before the meat turned. There was no negotiating with a reindeer's migration schedule. If a band of hunters arrived at a river crossing 3 days late because of illness, because of a broken tool, because of a decision that in hindsight seemed small, the herd might already be gone, and there would be no second herd coming through until the following year. The margin between a well-fed winter and a starving one could come down to a handful of days, or a handful of preserved carcasses processed correctly, instead of left too long in the autumn sun. Further south, in regions where wild grains and tubers offered a more forgiving seasonal pattern, the danger shifted rather than disappeared. Wild cereal grasses, the ancestors of the grains that would eventually become wheat and barley, ripened in a window, lasting only a few weeks before the seed heads shattered and scattered themselves uselessly across the ground. Communities that gathered these grains had to time their harvest with real precision, arriving neither too early, when the seeds were still soft and unripe, nor too late when the plant had already released its grain to the wind. Once gathered, the grain itself was far from safe. Left damp, it moulded. Left exposed, it drew insects and rodents that could destroy a season's worth of gathering in a matter of weeks. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how early these communities developed. Reliable underground storage pits lined with clay or ash to keep moisture and pests away from stored grain. But archaeological sites in the Levant suggest that some form of below-ground storage was already in use many thousands of years before anyone planted the first deliberate crop. In other words, human beings were solving the problem of keeping food edible long before they solved the seemingly more fundamental problem of growing it in the first place. Preservation, it turns out, may not have followed agriculture. It may have made agriculture possible at all. There is something quietly humbling in that idea. We tend to think of the story of human civilization as beginning with the plough, with someone deciding to plant a seed instead of simply gathering what grew wild. But a farmer who cannot keep a harvest edible through the winter gains nothing from planting it in the first place. The true foundation of settled life was never simply growing more food. It was learning how to make food outlast its own natural clock, buying weeks, then months, of safety against a world that offered no guarantees. Every technique that feels almost primitive to modernize, drying strips of meat in the wind, packing berries into fat to seal out air, bearing roots in cool damp earth to sow their decay, represents an enormous hard-won body of practical knowledge, refined over countless generations of watching food fail and adjusting accordingly. Nothing about it was obvious. Nothing about it was guaranteed to work the same way twice, because humidity, temperature, insect populations, and a dozen other variables shifted from year to year and place to place. Communities that guessed wrong did not get a gentle warning. They simply grew hungrier as the winter wore on, and in the hardest years some of them did not survive to try again the following season. This is also where the deeper, more human layer of the story begins to surface, because the burden of this seasonal arithmetic rarely fell evenly. In most reconstructed hunter-gatherer societies, it was often women working in close collaboration with children and elders who carried the bulk of the processing labor, the endless hours of scraping, drying, smoking, and packing that turned a successful hunt or harvest into something that could actually last. The hunters who brought down the reindeer or speared the salmon are the figures we tend to picture when we imagine this era: dramatic, active, decisive. But it was often the patient, repetitive, unglamorous labour happening back at the camp, hour after hour, that determined whether that single successful hunt translated into a family surviving February or not. History has a long habit of remembering the chase and forgetting the fire, and so the rhythm repeated itself year after year, generation after generation, a slow pulse of plenty and scarcity that shaped not just what people ate, but how they thought about time itself, about risk, about cooperation, about the difference between having enough today and having enough when it would actually matter. It is a rhythm that modern life has almost entirely erased from memory, buried under refrigerators that hum quietly through every season without complaint. But for the vast majority of human history, that rhythm was the true shape of a year, and getting it wrong even slightly carried a weight that is difficult for us to fully imagine now. What comes next in this story is the moment when that rhythm stopped, simply demanded careful management, and began in certain places and certain centuries to turn genuinely lethal, when the margins narrowed so far that entire communities found themselves staring directly into the consequences of a single failed harvest or a single spoiled store. Somewhere around 11,000 years ago, in the hill country that stretches between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, something shifted that would quietly reorganize the entire structure of human life. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened slowly, almost invisibly, as communities that had spent countless generations perfecting the art of gathering and preserving wild grain began in certain favored valleys to plant that grain deliberately, instead of simply harvesting it where it grew. This decision, so ordinary in hindsight, so easy to reduce to a single sentence in a textbook, actually represented one of the most consequential gambles our species has ever made, because it did not just change how people got their food, it changed who controlled it, and in doing so, it changed the very shape of power itself. Consider what a surplus actually meant to a community that had for tens of thousands of years lived close to the edge of its own food supply. A family that managed to grow more wheat or barley than it needed to survive. The winter suddenly possessed something entirely new in human experience, a form of wealth that did not need to be eaten immediately. Grain properly dried and stored could last for a year, sometimes longer. It could be set aside. It could be counted. It could, crucially, be owned in a way that a freshly killed reindeer or a basket of wild berries never could be. And where there is something that can be owned, counted, and withheld, human beings have shown across every culture and every era an almost unfailing instinct to build systems of control around it. This is where the granary enters the story, and it is difficult to overstate how radical an invention it truly was. Archaeological excavations at sites in the Jordan Valley dating back roughly 11,000 years have uncovered some of the earliest known grain storage structures. Small circular buildings raised slightly off the ground on stone footings likely to keep rodents and damp earth away from the precious grain inside. What is striking about these structures is that they appear before archaeologists find clear evidence of permanent large-scale house construction in the same communities. In other words, the earliest human beings in this region may have built dedicated engineered structures to protect their food before they built comparably sophisticated structures to protect themselves. The message embedded in that choice is almost unbearably direct. Nothing mattered more than keeping the harvest safe, because everything else, survival status, the ability to plan a future at all, depended entirely on whether that grain stayed dry, stayed cool, and stayed out of the reach of insects, rot, and thieves. And once a granary existed, once a surplus could be gathered in one place and held there through the year, an entirely new kind of person became possible, the person who controlled the door. Scholars still debate exactly how quickly this shifted into formal hierarchy, whether early granary keepers were chosen by consensus as trusted community members, or whether control over stored grain became almost immediately a tool for a smaller and smaller number of people to claim authority over everyone else. The evidence remains incomplete, pieced together from the size and placement of storage structures relative to individual dwellings, from burial goods that suggest growing inequality between households, and from the layout of early settlements that increasingly organized themselves around a central storage complex rather than spreading evenly across the landscape. What is clear is that within a relatively short span of generations, some of the very first human societies with permanent grain storage also show the very first archaeological signs of meaningful social inequality. The two seem to have arrived together almost as if they were never truly separate phenomena at all. There is a particular kind of vulnerability that comes with this arrangement, one that a purely nomadic hunting and gathering life had never really faced in the same way. A hunter-gatherer band that lost its food supply could, however, painfully move. It could follow the herds elsewhere, seek out a different valley, adapt its location to the failure. A community with a fixed granary, a community that had built houses and dug storage pits and organized its entire yearly rhythm around a single harvest in a single place, had made a kind of promise to that particular patch of earth. If the harvest failed, their moving was no longer a simple matter of walking to better ground. It meant abandoning houses, abandoning stored tools, abandoning the graves of ancestors, abandoning an entire built world that had taken generations to establish. This is one of the quieter costs of settled agricultural life that rarely makes it into the popular telling of the story. The same granary that offered unprecedented security in a good year also created an entirely new and much deeper kind of danger in a bad one, because the community's fate became tied to a single location in a way it had never been before. The vulnerability was not simply about drought or bad weather either, though those threats were constant and severe. It was also about what happened inside the granary itself, once the grain was sealed away and mostly out of sight. Grain stored even slightly damp becomes a breeding ground for fungal growth, and one particular fungus, a dark curved growth known today as ergot, would go on to haunt agricultural communities for thousands of years in ways that are only fully understood by modern science. Ergot grows on rye and certain other grains, particularly in cool, wet growing seasons, and when contaminated grain is milled into flour and baked into bread, it can cause a condition involving burning sensations in the limbs, hallucinations, convulsions, and in severe cases, gangrene and death. For most of history, communities struck by outbreaks of this poisoning had no way of understanding what was happening to them. They saw neighbors and family members seized by terrifying symptoms, sometimes entire villages afflicted at once, and they reached for the explanations available to them, which were often rooted in fear of curses, witchcraft, or divine punishment. It would take until the modern era for researchers to trace these episodes back to a fungus quietly growing inside the very storage systems that were supposed to guarantee survival. The granary, in other words, the single invention that had done more than perhaps any other to give early farming communities a sense of security against hunger, could also under wrong conditions become the source of a slow and terrifying poison hidden inside the very abundance it meant. This duality sits at the heart of what agriculture actually did to the human relationship with food. It did not simply solve the ancient problem of scarcity, it transformed that problem into something more complex layered, with new risks that earlier, more mobile ways of life had never had to face in quite the same form. Yes, a well-managed granary could carry a community through a lean season in a way that no hunting and gathering strategy reliably could. But it also concentrated risk in a single static location vulnerable to flood, to fire, to pests, to fungal contamination, And eventually, as populations grew and settlements expanded to raiding by other communities who understood perfectly well that a full granary represented the difference between their own survival and starvation, the very existence of stored surplus, the thing that made settled life possible in the first place, also made settled life a target in a way that a mobile band with no fixed granary to defend had simply never needed to worry about. What emerges from this period when we look closely at it is not a simple story of progress, humanity moving steadily from a harder, more precarious past toward an easier, more secure future. It is a story of trade. Early farming communities traded the flexibility of movement for the promise of stored abundance, and in doing so they accepted an entirely new category of risk. One measured not in the unpredictability of a migrating herd, but in the fragility of walls' roofs and sealed storage pits, and in the trustworthiness of whoever happened to hold the keys to what was inside them. Some communities managed this trade well, building storage systems robust enough and social structures fair enough to weather bad years without collapsing. Others did not, and the archaeological record, quiet and patient as it always is, still holds the evidence of exactly what happened when the balance tipped the wrong way. It's worth sitting with that idea for a moment in the dark before we go any further, because the story of what happens next in this history, the winters when the storehouses truly did run empty, and the communities that had to face what came after, is not really a story about ancient people so different from us. It is a story about a decision every settled society has had to make since that first granary rose above the floor of a Jordan Valley settlement 11,000 years ago. The decision to trust that the walls will hold, that the grain will stay dry, and that whoever controls the door will remember when the season turns hard, exactly what that trust was supposed to mean. There is a particular kind of danger that spoiled food carries, one that has nothing to do with hunger at all, and it deserves its own careful telling, because for most of human history, the greatest threat inside a meal was not that it might run out. It was that it might still be there sitting on the table, looking and selling almost exactly the way it should, while carrying something inside it capable of killing the person who ate it within hours. Walk with me into a farmhouse kitchen in the German region of Swabia, sometime in the early 1800s. A family has just finished a meal built around a length of homemade blood sausage, a dish prepared the way it had always been prepared, stuffed by hand, smoked over a slow fire, and stored in the cool of a cellar for the weeks ahead. Nothing about the process was new, nothing about the sausage looked or smelled wrong, and yet within a day, members of that household begin to feel a strange heaviness behind their eyes, a dryness in the mouth that water cannot seem to fix, a creeping weakness moving down through their arms and legs. In the worst cases, breathing itself becomes difficult and then impossible. This was not an isolated tragedy. Across the villages of Swabia in this period, physicians were recording outbreak after outbreak of what local doctors came to call sausage poisoning, a mysterious illness that seemed to strike without warning, tied somehow to homemade cured meats that gave no visible sign of anything being wrong. A country doctor and poet named Justinus Kerner spent years collecting and studying these cases, interviewing survivors, examining the conditions under which the sausages had been prepared, and slowly building one of the first systematic medical investigations into what we now understand as botulism, a poisoning caused by a toxin produced by bacteria that thrive specifically in the low-oxygen environment inside a tightly packed, poorly cured sausage. Kerner could not see the bacteria responsible. The tools to do that were still decades away, but through patient, almost obsessive observation, he correctly identified that the danger came from something forming inside the meat itself during storage. Something invisible, something that had nothing to do with obvious rot or bad smell. He even speculated with startling foresight for his era that this substance might eventually be isolated and even used medicinally in tiny controlled amounts. It would take the better part of a century for science to confirm the bacterium responsible and longer still to develop the modern medical treatments that grew indirectly out of Kerner's careful notes. What makes this story so unsettling and so important to sit with for a moment is the realization it points toward one that runs against almost everything we instinctively assume about spoiled food. We tend to imagine danger announcing itself a smell, a slime, an unmistakable wrongness that any reasonable person would notice and avoid. For most of history, that assumption was often true, and it saved countless lives because the human sense of smell is in its own right a remarkably sophisticated early warning system built by millions of years of evolution specifically to detect the compounds released by decaying protein. But botulism, along with several other forms of food poisoning that history would only slowly come to understand, does not always play by those rules. A sausage riddled with the toxin can look perfectly appetizing, smell entirely normal, and still be lethal within a single serving. For families who had spent generations learning to trust their senses as the final judge of what was safe to eat, this was a genuinely terrifying category of failure, an enemy that did not announce itself at all. Is it any wonder then that so many farming cultures developed elaborate, almost ritualistic rules around the preparation of preserved meats, rules that on the surface look like superstition, but often encoded real hard-won survival knowledge? Certain regions insisted that sausages be pricked with a needle before smoking to allow trapped air to escape, a practice that, whether or not the people following it understood exactly why, happened to reduce the low oxygen conditions in which the deadliest bacteria thrived. Other communities developed strict taboos against reusing curing brine from one season to the next, or against storing meat in containers that had held meat before without thorough cleaning in between. None of this came from laboratories. It came from grief from the accumulated memory of households that had lost someone and searched desperately for what had gone wrong, then passed a stricter rule forward to the next generation so that it might not happen again. The evidence remains incomplete for exactly how far back this particular danger stretches, since the physical traces of a toxin are far harder for archaeologists to detect than the visible signs of malnutrition or violent injury preserved in bone. Scholars still debate how many unexplained sudden deaths recorded in ancient and medieval texts, deaths attributed at the time to curses, evil spirits, or the wrath of an offended household god, might actually have been cases of what we would now recognize as bacterial food poisoning moving invisibly through a preserved food supply. What is clear is that this particular threat arriving without warning inside food that gave every outward sign of safety occupied a very different psychological space than the more familiar dangers of visible rot or empty granaries. It was not a danger you could outplan through diligence alone. It was a danger baked quite literally into the very techniques that made survival possible in the first place, the same low oxygen packing and slow curing that allowed meat to last through a long winter, also created under certain conditions exactly the environment where this invisible threat could take hold. There is a second, quieter thread to this part of the story, one that unfolds not in farmhouse kitchens, but in the crowded, undernourished conditions of early armies and long sea voyages, where large numbers of people relied on the same limited, often poorly preserved food supply for extended periods of time. Military physicians accompanying campaigns in the 18th and 19th centuries frequently noted mysterious waves of illness moving through the ranks. Illness they struggled to explain tied loosely and often incorrectly to bad air, foul water, or general uncleanliness. Only with hindsight and the benefit of modern microbiology can historians now look back at some of these outbreaks and recognize the likely signature of contaminated preserved rations, meat or grain stores that had turned in ways the human eye and nose alone could not always catch, especially once heavily salted or smoked to mask early signs of decay. And an army moving on preserved rations was, in a very real sense, gambling every single day on the integrity of a supply chain that stretched back weeks or months through preparation methods that varied wildly in skill and care from one supplier to the next. What emerges from all of this, gathered across kitchens and campaigns and centuries, is a fuller and more honest picture of what it truly meant to eat safely before the modern understanding of bacteria and toxins existed. It was not simply a matter of avoiding food that looked or smelled wrong, though that instinct mattered enormously and saved countless lives across the long span of human history. It was also a matter of trusting an entire invisible chain of preparation, curing, storage, and time any single link of which could quietly turn a meal meant to sustain a family into something capable of destroying it without ever giving a visible warning. Communities responded the only way they could, through accumulated caution, inherited ritual, and a kind of collective hard-earned wisdom that modern science would only later be able to explain in terms of bacteria, toxins, and oxygen levels. They could not see the enemy. But across generations, piece by painful piece, they learned to recognize its shape. It is a strange kind of comfort in a way to realize that so much of what feels like ordinary kitchen habit today, cooking meat thoroughly, avoiding food that has sat too long in a sealed container, trusting a strange smell over a normal-looking surface, carries inside it the memory of centuries of quiet loss refined slowly into instinct. And it sets the stage for what comes next in this story, because understanding how these dangers hid inside the food itself is only half the picture. The other half lives in what happened when an entire community, not just a single household, found itself facing a season where there was simply not enough food left to preserve at all, no matter how carefully anyone worked. The techniques a family in a smoke-filled cottage might use to keep a season's meat edible rarely stayed a purely private matter for long. Once human beings discovered that certain substances and certain conditions could reliably slow the process of decay, those substances became something else entirely, something worth trading, taxing, fighting over, and in some cases, building entire economies around. Nowhere is this clearer than with salt, a substance so central to preservation and survival that its presence or absence could quietly determine the fate of empires. Consider the sheer logistics of what salt actually made possible. A side of pork or a haul of fish packed properly in salt could last for months rather than days, which meant that food produced in one region could now travel to feed people hundreds of miles away, across a season, across a border, across an ocean. This single fact reorganized trade routes across the ancient and medieval world. Roman legions marching through unfamiliar territory depended on salted provisions to sustain campaigns that stretched on for months, far beyond what fresh food could ever support. There is a long-standing popular belief that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid a portion of their wages specifically in salt, and that the modern word for wages traces its origin directly back to that practice. Historians who study the actual Latin sources are considerably more cautious about this claim than popular retellings tend to be, noting that the word likely derives instead from money. Soldiers were given to purchase salt among other provisions, a related but meaningfully different arrangement. Still, even setting aside the more romantic version of that story, the underlying truth remains solid. Salt was valuable enough, essential enough to survival and to the functioning of an army, that controlling its supply meant controlling something close to the machinery of empire itself. That same logic played out again and again across very different corners of the world, often without any of these cultures having contact with one another. In imperial China, salt production and distribution became one of the earliest and most tightly controlled state monopolies in recorded history, with government officials overseeing production along the coast and inland brine wells, and taxing its sale so heavily that salt revenue at various points funded a significant share of the entire imperial treasury. A ruler who controlled salt controlled indirectly whether a farming family 2 provinces away could safely preserve a pig through the winter. That is an extraordinary amount of quiet power concentrated in something as simple as white crystals scraped from evaporated seawater or drawn up from ancient underground deposits. Salt was never the only tool in this ancient arsenal, though it may have been the most universally prized. Along the cold, wind-scoured coastline of Norway, communities developed an entirely different solution, one that required almost no salt at all, relying instead on the region's dry, frigid winter air. Cod caught in the deep waters off the Lofoten Islands were split cleaned and hung outdoors on wooden racks through the winter months, where the combination of cold temperatures, low humidity and steady wind drew the moisture out of the fish slowly over several weeks, leaving behind a hard, pale product that could last for years rather than months. This dried fish, sometimes called stockfish, became one of the most important trade commodities of the medieval North Atlantic world, carried south along Viking and later Hanseatic trade routes to feed populations as far away as the Mediterranean, where it remains to this day. A genuinely beloved ingredient in certain regional Italian and Portuguese dishes, a direct culinary echo of a preservation technique that is well over 1,000 years old. It is a strange thought, isn't it, that a dish served today in a warm coastal restaurant in Lisbon or Naples exists at all because of Norwegian fishermen solving a problem of decay many centuries ago, using nothing more than cold wind and patience. Cold itself, in fact, became one of humanity's oldest and most ingeniously pursued preservation tools long before anything resembling mechanical refrigeration existed. In ancient Persia, engineers developed a remarkable structure known as the yakchal, a tall dome-shaped building made of a specially formulated heat-resistant mortar designed to store ice through the blistering heat of the desert summer. Builders would harvest ice from nearby mountains during the winter, or channel water into shallow pools on cold nights to freeze naturally, then pack the resulting ice into the shaded, cleverly ventilated chamber of the yakchal, where evaporative cooling and careful architectural design could keep the contents frozen or near frozen for months, even as outside temperatures climbed well above human body heat. Some of these structures remarkably still stand today, silent monuments to just how seriously ancient engineers took the problem of keeping things cold in a place where cold was the rarest resource of all. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread ice trade and ice storage were across the broader ancient world beyond Persia, since evidence is scattered and often circumstantial. But the existence of the yakchal alone demonstrates a level of sophisticated, dedicated engineering aimed at a single purpose, defeating decay through cold, that most people today would never associate with the ancient world at all. There is another category of preservation that deserves real attention here, one that worked through an entirely different principle than salt, smoke or cold, and that is fermentation, a process that does not simply slow decay, but actively transforms food using the deliberate cultivation of specific beneficial microorganisms. Long before anyone understood what a microorganism was, communities across the world had independently discovered that cabbage packed tightly with salt and left to sit would, rather than rotting, transform into something tangy, long-lasting and packed with nutrients that helped prevent certain deficiency diseases during long winters without fresh vegetables. Sailors on long ocean voyages, though scientific understanding of vitamins was still centuries away, gradually came to associate fermented cabbage and similar preserved foods with better health and fewer outbreaks of the debilitating illnesses that so often plagued extended sea travel. Similar fermentation traditions developed independently across Korea, where seasoned fermented vegetables became a cultural cornerstone that persists powerfully to this day, and across the dairy-producing regions of Europe and Central Asia, where fresh milk itself One of the most highly perishable foods available to early herding societies could be transformed through fermentation into cheese and cultured products capable of lasting weeks or months rather than a single day. What ties all of these very different techniques together? Salt drawn from the sea or the earth, cold harvested from mountain winters and sealed inside desert domes. Wind and frost working slowly on hanging fish, unseen microorganisms, transforming cabbage and milk into something new and stable as a shared human recognition arrived at independently again and again across cultures with no contact with one another. That decay was not an unbeatable force. It could be slowed. It could sometimes even be turned into an advantage, producing foods with flavors and qualities that fresh ingredients never had in the first place. But every single one of these solutions demanded resources. Salt mines, favorable coastal winds, specialized architecture, generations of accumulated fermentation knowledge, and every one of them remained, even at their most sophisticated, fundamentally a form of borrowed time. A yak chow could keep ice frozen for months, not forever. Salted meat could last a season, not indefinitely. Even the finest stockfish dried to near perfection on a Lofoten rack would eventually succumb if stored carelessly or left too long. Every technique bought precious weeks and months against an outcome that remained ultimately unavoidable without these interventions, repeated faithfully season after season, by hands that understood exactly what was at stake if the work was done poorly or not done at all. And this is precisely where the fragility of the whole system reveals itself most clearly, because all of these remarkable solutions depended entirely on conditions holding steady, enough salt reaching the right markets, enough cold winters to freeze the yak jal's ice, enough dry, windy weather along the Norwegian coast at exactly the right moment in the fishing season. When those conditions failed, when a war disrupted the salt trade, when an unusually mild winter left the icehouses empty, when relentless rain ruined a season's drying racks before the fish could cure properly, communities that had built their entire survival strategy around these fragile systems found themselves facing a danger that no amount of accumulated wisdom could fully protect them from. The techniques were extraordinary, but they were never invincible, and the story of what happened when they failed, not in some isolated household, but across entire regions at once, is where this history is about to lead us next. The spring of the year 1315 arrived across northern Europe wrong. Anyone who worked the land could feel it before they could explain it, a wrongness in the air itself. A heaviness that would not lift. Rain fell in April and did not stop. It fell through May, through June, through the entire planting season, turning fields that should have been drying under early summer sun into standing pools of mud. Farmers who had spent their entire lives reading the sky, who understood exactly when to plant and exactly how much a normal wet spring should slow them down, found themselves facing something none of their accumulated knowledge had prepared them for: a season with no dry stretch at all, no window in which grain could be sown properly, or hay could be cut and cured before it rotted where it lay. What followed is now understood by historians as the opening act of what would become known as the Great Famine, a catastrophe that would grip England, France, the Low Countries, and much of Germany and Scandinavia for roughly 2 years. And whose full effects would linger in weakened harvests and weakened bodies for years beyond that. It stands as one of the clearest and most thoroughly documented examples in all of European history of what happens when the entire preservation and storage system a civilization depends on fails simultaneously across an enormous geographic area with nowhere nearby. By turn for relief. To understand how devastating this truly was, it helps to remember just how narrow the margin for error had become in 14th century Europe. Populations had grown substantially over the preceding centuries, pressing right up against the limits of what the available farmland using the agricultural methods of the time could reliably produce even in a good year. Grain reserves in most regions were calculated to carry a community through a normal winter. with perhaps a modest buffer against a single difficult season. Nobody had built a system designed to survive 2 consecutive catastrophic harvests in a row because nothing in living memory had suggested that such a thing was possible. The rains of 1315 destroyed far more than the crops standing in the fields that particular year. They destroyed the very possibility of preservation itself. Grain that is meant to be dried and stored requires quite simply dry conditions in which to do that drying, and a summer without any meaningful dry stretch meant that even the portion of the harvest that survived the flooding could not be properly cured before storage. Damp grain packed into the granaries under these conditions did not last through the winter the way a normal harvest would have. It moulded. It rotted from the inside, sometimes without obvious outward signs, until the grain was kneaded and opened only to reveal itself ruined. Communities that believed, based on the size of their harvest, that they had secured enough to survive the winter, discovered in the depths of that winter that a significant portion of what they thought they had stored away was no longer edible at all. Livestock fared no better, and their losses compounded the crisis in ways that rippled forward for years. Hay meant to feed animals through the winter rotted in the fields before it could be properly dried and stored, leaving farmers with grievously insufficient fodder. Chroniclers of the period describe widespread livestock deaths from starvation and disease across the affected regions, a catastrophic loss that meant far more than the immediate absence of meat. Draft animals, the oxen and horses needed to plough fields for the following year's planting, died in such numbers that even communities hoping to recover quickly in the following season found themselves without the animal labour required to work their land properly. The famine, in other words, was not a single bad year that could simply be endured until conditions improved. It actively undermined the very capacity of these societies to produce a better harvest the following season, a vicious cycle that dragged the crisis forward year after year. By the winter of 1315 into 1316, conditions across the affected regions had become genuinely desperate. Contemporary chroniclers writing in monasteries and city records across England and continental Europe describe scenes that are difficult to read even at a distance of 7 centuries. Grain prices climbed to levels several times higher than normal, placing even the reduced and often spoiled harvest that did exist entirely out of reach for poorer households. Reports from several regions describe people reduced to eating what would normally be considered entirely inedible tree bark ground into a kind of flower roots dug from the frozen ground. The bodies of animals that had already died of disease or starvation rather than proper slaughter. Some chronicles from this period contain accounts of far more extreme desperation, still including references to cannibalism in the most severely affected areas. Historians studying these accounts urge real caution here. Medieval chroniclers writing about famine sometimes drew on established literary traditions of describing catastrophe in the most extreme terms available to them, partly as a way of conveying the true scale of suffering to readers who had not witnessed it directly, and it remains genuinely difficult, this far removed from the events themselves, to separate confirmed fact from exaggeration rooted in the storytelling conventions of the age. What is not in dispute, because it is confirmed across multiple independent sources and supported by later demographic research, is that mortality across the affected regions rose dramatically, with some historians estimating that the famine and its associated diseases killed somewhere between 5 and 12% of the total population across the affected areas of Northern Europe. A staggering loss by any measure, concentrated overwhelmingly among the poorest households who had the least buffer against a failed harvest to begin with. There is a particular kind of cruelty embedded in how a famine like this actually kills one that goes beyond simple starvation, and it deserves to be understood clearly. Severe prolonged malnutrition does not typically kill quickly on its own. What it does instead is dismantle the body's ability to defend itself against ordinary threats that a well-fed population would usually survive without much difficulty. Historical records from the Great Famine describe waves of disease sweeping through weakened populations, dysentery, respiratory illness, and other infections that found almost no resistance in bodies already pushed past their limits by months of insufficient food. Modern researchers studying the demographic patterns of this period note that much of the elevated mortality likely came not directly from starvation itself, but from this secondary wave of disease moving through populations whose immune systems had been quietly, catastrophically compromised by hunger. The famine did not simply take away food, it took away the body's capacity to survive nearly everything else life could throw at it. Why did an entire continent spanning multiple kingdoms and countless independent communities prove so uniformly vulnerable to a run of bad weather? Modern climate historians examining tree ring data, glacial ice cores and other physical evidence have identified this period as falling within the early stages of what researchers now call the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long shift toward a cooler, more unstable climate across much of the Northern Hemisphere. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how directly this broader climatic shift caused the specific catastrophic rains of 1315, since regional weather in any single year involves an enormous number of variables beyond a long-term climate trend alone. Scholars still debate the precise mechanisms connecting the two, whether shifting ocean temperatures, changes in atmospheric circulation patterns, or some combination of factors not yet fully understood played the largest role. But the broader pattern is well supported by the physical evidence, a genuine cooling and destabilizing of the climate across this period, arriving at precisely the moment when European populations had grown large enough and agricultural systems had become stretched thin enough that there was almost no margin left to absorb a genuine shock. It is worth pausing here to notice something quietly remarkable within this tragedy. Something easy to overlook amid the scale of the suffering involved. The very preservation systems this story has spent so much time exploring, the granaries, the salting, the careful seasonal calculations passed down through countless generations, were not absent during the Great Famine. They existed. They had been built and refined over centuries specifically to guard against exactly this kind of crisis. What failed was not the concept of preservation itself, but its capacity to absorb a shock of this particular scale and duration. 2 consecutive ruined growing seasons across an enormous geographic area, with no unaffected neighbouring region large enough to meaningfully offset the loss through trade. Preservation technology, however sophisticated, could buy communities weeks and months against an ordinary bad season. It had never been designed, because no one had ever imagined the need, to buy an entire population 2 full years against a climate that had turned against it almost everywhere at once. The famine did eventually loosen its grip as harvests slowly began to recover toward the end of the decade, though full recovery took considerably longer than the crisis itself had lasted. Given how thoroughly it had depleted livestock herds, seed stocks, and the physical strength of surviving farming populations. But the Great Famine of the early 14th century left something behind beyond its immediate death toll, a kind of scar in the collective memory and administrative practice of the regions it touched. Several cities and territories in its aftermath began developing more formal systems of centralized grain reserves, early forerunners of the kind of coordinated famine relief and stockpiling that would slowly, unevenly over the coming centuries become a more standard feature of European governance. It is a sobering thought, isn't it, that some of the earliest organized institutional responses to famine in European history were born not from foresight but from the raw remembered horror of watching an entire preservation system, one that had worked reliably for generations, buckle under a strain no one had believed possible until they lived through it. What remains 7 centuries later is not only the written record left by frightened chroniclers, but a quieter, more physical kind of evidence buried in soil layers, in tree rings, in the bones of those who lived and died through those 2 terrible years, waiting patiently for the tools that would eventually let later generations read exactly what those bones and layers of earth have to say about a catastrophe that, for those who lived through it, must have felt very much like the entire world had simply stopped keeping its promises. Long after the last chronicler who wrote about the Great Famine had died, and long after the memory of those 2 terrible years had faded into little more than a grim footnote in regional histories, an entirely different kind of witness remained behind, patient and silent, waiting in the ground for someone to learn how to ask it the right questions. That witness is the human skeleton itself, and over the past several decades, the science of reading it has become sophisticated enough to reconstruct with startling precision exactly what a body endured during a season when preservation failed and food ran short. Bioarchaeologists, researchers who specialize in what skeletal remains can reveal about the lived experience of past populations have developed a genuinely remarkable set of tools for this kind of detective work. Among the most telling are what are known as Harris lines, faint bands of increased bone density that form near the growing ends of long bones, particularly in children and adolescents, whenever normal growth is interrupted by illness or malnutrition and then resumes once conditions improve. Under an X-ray or a careful cross-section, these lines appear almost like the growth rings of a tree, each one marking a period when a young body's development came to a temporary halt. Skeletal populations excavated from regions and periods associated with known famines consistently show a higher frequency of these lines than populations from more stable eras, and in some cases, researchers can even estimate roughly how many separate episodes of severe nutritional stress a particular individual endured across their childhood simply by counting the bands preserved in a single bone. Teeth carry an even more precise version of this same kind of record. Dental enamel once formed during childhood does not remodel or repair itself the way bone does, which means it preserves a permanent, unchangeable record of stress experienced during the specific narrow window when that particular tooth was developing. Researchers studying what are called enamel hyperplasias, thin, horizontal grooves or pits visible on the surface of a tooth, can sometimes narrow down not just whether a person experienced a period of severe malnutrition or illness in childhood, but approximately how old they were when it happened, based on which teeth and which specific bands of enamel show the disruption. There is something quietly extraordinary in that idea. Somewhere in a museum drawer or a laboratory storage box today, there may sit teeth belonging to a child who lived through the winter of 1315 teeth that still carry, etched permanently into their enamel, the precise record of exactly how old that child was when the harvest failed and the granaries came up empty. Bone chemistry offers a different but equally revealing window into this history. When researchers analyze the ratios of certain stable isotopes variants of element, like carbon and nitrogen preserved within bone collagen, they can reconstruct a surprisingly detailed picture of what a person actually ate over the final years of their life, since the chemical signature of different food sources becomes incorporated directly into the growing skeleton. Isotope studies conducted on skeletal remains from several documented famine periods across medieval Europe have revealed measurable shifts in diet, consistent with populations turning toward lower quality, less nutritionally dense food sources during crisis years, exactly the kind of dietary substitution that contemporary chroniclers described in writing tree bark, wild roots and other foods not normally part of the regular diet. It is a rare and moving thing when the written record left by frightened, grieving people 7 centuries ago and the silent chemical record locked inside their bones agree with each other this closely, each confirming independently that the other is telling the truth. Beyond the skeletons themselves, the built environment left behind by past societies offers its own form of testimony. And this is where the archaeology of granaries and storage structures becomes genuinely fascinating. Excavations of settlement sites across regions affected by major famines sometimes reveal a telling pattern in the storage architecture. Granaries that appear to have been hastily expanded or supplemented with makeshift additional storage pits in the years immediately following a crisis, physical evidence of communities attempting, often too late, to build greater resilience into a system that had just catastrophically failed them. In certain excavated medieval sites in England, archaeologists have identified what appear to be emergency storage pits dug outside the normal footprint of established granary complexes, rougher in construction and seemingly improvised, dating to periods that align closely with known famine years. The evidence remains incomplete regarding whether these particular structures were built during the crisis itself in a desperate attempt to secure whatever food remained, or in its immediate aftermath as a lesson hastily applied by survivors determined not to be caught so unprepared again. Either interpretation tells essentially the same story, a community that had just been taught, in the harshest possible way, exactly how fragile its margin for survival truly was. Perhaps the most unexpected source of evidence in this entire field comes not from human remains or storage structures at all, but from something almost embarrassingly ordinary: ancient garbage. Archaeologists who specialize in what is sometimes called zoo archaeology, the study of animal remains recovered from historical sites, pay very close attention to the bones discarded in refuse pits and middens near settlements, because what a household throws away can reveal almost as much as what it chooses to keep. During periods of genuine food crisis, the animal bones recovered from refuse deposits frequently show a distinct shift in butchery patterns, cut marks appearing in unusual places, evidence of marrow being extracted from bones that would normally have been discarded, whole evidence that animals were being processed far more thoroughly than usual with every last usable scrap of meat fat, and marrow carefully removed before the bone was finally thrown away. In more stable, well-fed periods, the same species of animal often shows far less intensive butchery, bones discarded with more meat and marrow, still attached, a kind of casual waste that simply becomes impossible to afford once real scarcity sets in. Reading these patterns side by side, archaeologists can trace layer by layer through a single refuse pit the precise moment a community's relationship with its food supply shifted from comfortable to desperate, written not in any text but in the small mundane act of exactly how carefully a bone was scraped clean before it was thrown away. What makes all of this evidence so powerful taken together is how it converges from entirely independent directions toward the same underlying story. A Harris line in a tibia, an isotope signature in a rib, a hastily dug storage pit outside a manor's main granary, a heavily scraped animal bone in a refuse midden. None of these sources knew anything about the others when they were formed. They are not a single narrative constructed after the fact. They are separate silent witnesses, scattered across different materials and different locations that happen to tell remarkably consistent versions of the same underlying truth whenever researchers learn how to read them properly. Scholars still debate certain finer details of interpretation. How directly a particular Harris line can be tied to a specific documented famine year, rather than some other less dramatic period of childhood illness, or how representative a single excavated refuse pit truly is of an entire community's experience. This kind of careful academic caution is not a weakness in the science. It is precisely what makes the strong conclusions, the ones that do hold up consistently across many independent sites and many different lines of evidence, so genuinely trustworthy. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this evidence exists at all, buried and waiting for so many centuries before anyone possessed the tools to read it properly. The people who lived through the Great Famine, who watched their granaries fail and their livestock die and their children grow thin through a winter that would not end, had no way of knowing that their bones, their garbage, and their hastily improvised storage pits would someday speak on their behalf, filling in details their own written records either omitted or exaggerated beyond what actually happened. In a very real sense, science has given voice 700 years later to people who otherwise left behind no written testimony of their own at all. The poorest households, the ones least likely to appear by name in any surviving chronicle or tax record, precisely the households most likely to have suffered the worst of what that famine actually cost. And this raises a question worth carrying forward, one that this story is not quite finished answering. If the bones and the middens can tell us this much about ordinary households who left no other trace, what do the surviving written accounts, the letters, the court records, the first-hand testimonies from those who did know how to write add to a picture that the physical evidence alone cannot fully capture on its own? In the city of Ypres, in what is now Belgium, a set of municipal accounts from the famine years still survives in the civic archives, and it offers something the bones and refused pits, for all their eloquence, simply cannot provide on their own. A precise, itemized record of a city government trying in real time to manage a catastrophe it did not fully understand and could not fully control. These accounts show the city purchasing grain at increasingly desperate prices from distant merchants, record payments made to bury the dead in numbers that town officials clearly found difficult to keep pace with, and note almost in passing the establishment of what amounts to one of the earliest documented systems of organized public charity, aimed specifically at feeding the poorest residents through the worst of the crisis. Historians who have studied these ledgers closely note something quietly remarkable buried within the dry columns of expenditure. A shift over the course of the crisis from ordinary almsgiving, small scattered acts of individual charity, towards something more structured and centralized. City officials actively coordinating food distribution because the scale of need had simply outgrown what informal charity alone could handle. In its own understated bureaucratic way, Ypres may represent one of the earliest visible moments when a European city government began to treat famine relief as a formal civic responsibility rather than a private personal virtue. Not every written account from this period comes wrapped in the careful, dispassionate language of municipal bookkeeping. Some of the most striking testimony survives instead in the chronicles kept by monks' men, whose religious vocation gave them both the literacy to record what they witnessed and a particular framework for interpreting it. A monastic chronicler writing in the north of England during these years describes watching the price of grain climb to levels that placed even a modest loaf entirely out of reach for ordinary labourers, and records with evident distress the sight of people from the surrounding countryside arriving at the monastery gates in growing numbers, hoping for whatever charity the brothers could offer. Monasteries across the affected regions, many of which maintained their own granaries and food stores as part of their ordinary operation, found themselves functioning as informal emergency relief centres, their existing infrastructure for storing and distributing food suddenly pressed into service on a scale far beyond anything it had been designed for. Several surviving monastic records describe granary reserves that had been built up over years of careful, disciplined stewardship being exhausted within a single desperate season, a sobering reminder that even institutions with genuinely sophisticated preservation practices and real foresight could still be overwhelmed when the scale of need grew large enough. What these first-hand accounts add to the story more than any specific fact or figure is something closer to texture, the lived, felt experience of watching a crisis unfold day by day, rather than reconstructing it afterward from bones and ledgers. A chronicler in Flanders describes the particular anguish of watching people who had clearly once been respectable, self-sufficient members of their community reduced to begging at church doors, noting with something close to genuine bewilderment how quickly ordinary social standing seemed to dissolve once the food ran out. how thin the line actually was between a household of modest comfort and a household in genuine desperation. This kind of observation rarely survives in physical evidence alone. A skeleton can tell researchers a great deal about malnutrition, but it cannot easily convey the specific social humiliation a formerly respectable farmer might have felt standing at a monastery gate for the first time in his life, hand outstretched, uncertain whether he would be turned away. Court records from this period offer their own distinct and sometimes surprising window into how communities responded under this kind of sustained pressure. Legal records from several English counties show a marked increase in prosecutions for theft during the famine years, and what stands out to historians examining these cases is not simply the rise in numbers, but the nature of what was actually being stolen. Rather than valuable goods or money, the overwhelming majority of recorded thefts during this period involve food itself, grain, livestock, even in a number of documented cases produced still standing unharvested in another person's field. Judges and local officials handling these cases appear in several surviving records to have shown a degree of leniency toward famine-related food theft that stands in noticeable contrast to how theft was typically handled in more stable years, suggesting that even within a rigid medieval legal system there existed some recognized understanding that stealing bread to survive a genuine famine occupied a different moral category than ordinary criminal theft. It would be a mistake to overstate this leniency into something resembling full forgiveness or formal legal exception, since punishment for theft during this period remained real and often severe. But the pattern is there in the surviving records, a subtle human acknowledgement, even within an institution not typically known for its flexibility, that extraordinary circumstances sometimes called for a different kind of judgment. There is a particular category of surviving document that deserves special attention here because it captures something the more institutional records tend to miss entirely, and that is personal correspondence, private letters written between individuals rather than official reports intended for a wider audience. Very few personal letters survive from this specific period among the poorer classes, since literacy remained heavily concentrated among clergy, merchants and the nobility, but the letters that do survive from merchants and minor officials navigating the famine years offer glimpses of anxiety that feel remarkably immediate even across 7 centuries of distance. One surviving merchant's correspondence from the affected region describes in the practical transactional language, typical of business letters, growing difficulties securing reliable grain shipments, delayed deliveries, spoiled cargo, arriving at port already unfit for sale, and a palpable, raising concern about how much longer existing reserves could reasonably be expected to last. Reading a document like this feels almost like eavesdropping a private worry never intended for later ease, preserved by nothing more than historical accident and the durability of good parchment. Scholars still debate how representative any of these surviving written accounts truly are of the broader population's experience during the Great Famine, and this uncertainty deserves to be stated plainly rather than glossed over. The people who left behind chronicles, court testimony, and personal letters were almost without exception drawn from the literate minority clergy, merchants, minor, nobility town officials. The overwhelming majority of the population who actually lived through this crisis, the tenant farmers, the day labourers, the rural poor who almost certainly suffered the worst of the famine's consequences, left behind no writing of their own at all. This is precisely why the physical archaeological evidence explored earlier in this story matters so much, because it reaches populations the written record largely cannot. Neither source alone tells the complete story. Read together. The parchment and the bone, the ledger and the midden. They begin to fill in each other's blind spots, offering something closer to a full picture than either could provide in isolation. There is one more surviving thread worth pulling on here, because it reveals something genuinely unexpected about how communities processed a trauma of this scale once it had passed. In several regions affected by the Great Famine, local religious and civic calendars in the years and decades afterward show the establishment of new commemorative observances, feast days or memorial masses specifically tied to the famine years intended to mark and remember what the community had endured. This was not simply grief finding an outlet. It functioned in a very real and practical sense as a form of institutional memory, a deliberate mechanism for ensuring that the specific horror of those years would not simply fade from communal awareness once the generation that had lived through it eventually passed away. Is it not remarkable in its own quiet way that a society without any of our modern tools for preserving history still found a means through ritual and repetition to pass the memory of a catastrophe forward across generations, ensuring that even grandchildren who had never known real hunger themselves would grow up understanding exactly how fragile the harvest truly was and exactly how much depended on getting the preservation right? Taken all together, the chronicles, the municipal ledgers, the court records, the surviving fragments of private correspondence, and the deliberate rituals of remembrance built in the famine's aftermath. These written sources give this story something the physical evidence alone cannot fully supply: a sense of how people themselves understood what was happening to them while it was still happening, what they believed had gone wrong, and who they believed bore responsibility for it. And that question of who or what people actually blamed when the harvest failed and the granaries came up short turns out to be far less settled and far more revealing than it might first appear. For the people who lived through the Great Famine, the question of why it had happened was never a purely academic one. It was urgent, immediate, and deeply entangled with how a community understood its own relationship to the world, to God, and to the people who governed it. And the answers different groups reached for reveal almost as much about medieval society as the famine itself does. The most common explanation offered by the literate religious minority who left behind written accounts frame the catastrophe in explicitly moral and spiritual terms. Chroniclers across affected regions repeatedly describe the failed harvests and the suffering that followed as a form of divine punishment, a consequence of collective sin that God had allowed or actively caused to correct a wayward population. This was not a fringe or unusual interpretation. It reflected the dominant intellectual framework of the era, one in which natural disasters rarely stood as isolated, morally neutral events. A failed harvest was rarely just weather. It was a message, and communities searched anxiously for what exactly they had done to deserve it, and what acts of penance or reform might convince heaven to relent. Several surviving sermons from the period explicitly connect the ongoing suffering to calls for greater piety, stricter observance, and renewed devotion, suggesting that religious authorities saw the famine not only as a crisis to be endured, but as an opportunity, however grim, to reinforce spiritual discipline within a frightened population. Alongside this spiritual explanation, however, ran a second, more practical and more suspicious line of reasoning. One aimed not at heaven, but at the merchants, landlords and officials who controlled the actual distribution of what food remained. Several surviving records document popular anger directed at grain merchants accused of deliberately withholding stock to drive prices even higher during the crisis, a practice sometimes referred to in period sources as forestalling. Whether this kind of deliberate hoarding was actually widespread, or whether it represented a smaller number of genuine cases that became magnified in popular memory into something resembling a systemic conspiracy, remains a genuine point of historical uncertainty. The evidence remains incomplete on this question, since accusations of hoarding are considerably easier to find in surviving records than proof of hoarding actually occurring and desperate. Hungry populations have understandable reasons to suspect the worst of anyone visibly still eating well while others starved. What is clear is that this suspicion shaped real events. Several towns experienced documented unrest specifically targeting merchants and officials believed to be profiting from the crisis. Unrest serious enough in a handful of cases to prompt local authorities to impose emergency price controls on grain, an early and imperfect attempt at managing a market that had, in the eyes of ordinary people, clearly stopped functioning fairly. Modern historians working with the benefit of climate science, demographic modelling and comparative analysis across many other historical famines have developed a considerably more complex picture than either the divine punishment framework or the hoarding accusations alone could offer. Though notably, this modern picture does not simply dismiss either older explanation as pure superstition or scapegoating. Instead, contemporary scholarship tends to describe the Great Famine as what researchers sometimes call a compound crisis, a catastrophe produced not by any single cause, but by the simultaneous convergence of several separate mutually reinforcing pressures, each of which might have been survivable in isolation, but which together overwhelm the system entirely. The genuine climatic shift associated with the onset of the Little Ice Age created the initial trigger, the catastrophic rainfall that ruined 2 consecutive harvests. But this climatic shock landed on a population that had already grown to press right against the limits of available farmland using agricultural techniques that offered little flexibility to adapt quickly to changing conditions and operating within a political and economic structure where grain distribution, even in good years, was often shaped as much by the interests of landlords and merchants as by the actual nutritional needs of the general population. Remove any single one of these factors and historians generally agree the crisis would likely have been considerably less severe. The bad weather alone, without the underlying demographic and economic pressure, might have produced a difficult but survivable lean year, rather than a catastrophe that killed a meaningful share of an entire region's population. This raises a genuinely interesting question that scholars continue to actively debate, one that reaches well beyond this single 14th century catastrophe into how historians think about famine as a phenomenon more broadly across human history. Is a famine fundamentally a natural disaster, a failure of weather and harvest that simply overwhelms human systems no matter how well designed those systems might be? Or is a famine, even one triggered by genuinely catastrophic weather, ultimately better understood as a failure of human systems and distribution, since even in the depths of the worst years, food did not entirely vanish from the affected regions, it simply became inaccessible to the poorest households, while wealthier households and institutions, including in some documented cases the very merchants accused of hoarding, continued to eat reasonably well. This debate, sometimes framed by economists and historians in terms of whether famines represent an absolute shortage of food or a failure in how existing food gets distributed and who can actually afford access to it, did not originate with the Great Famine of the 14th century, and it certainly did not end there either. It remains an active and consequential area of historical and economic research to day one, with real implications for how modern societies think about famine prevention, because a purely weather-driven explanation suggests better agricultural technology as the primary solution, while a distribution-driven explanation points instead towards questions of governance, market regulation, and equity as being equally, perhaps even more important. There is a third layer to this question of blame and explanation that deserves careful, honest treatment because it connects directly to some of the darker chapters that would follow in subsequent centuries across the very regions the Great Famine had touched. In the years and decades after the crisis, as communities searched for explanations that made sense of suffering, on this scale, a small number of documented cases emerge of accusations against marginalized individuals and groups, blame assigned not to weather or hoarding merchants, but to supposed malevolent influence or supernatural wrongdoing. Historians studying the broader pattern of famine and plague across medieval and early modern Europe note that catastrophes of this magnitude frequently correlated in subsequent years with a documented rise in accusations of witchcraft and persecution of marginalized communities as frightened populations searched for a more immediate more punishable explanation for suffering that otherwise felt senselessly random and impossible to prevent. The connection between the Great Famine specifically and this broader pattern remains a subject scholars continue to investigate carefully, and it would be an overreach to draw too direct a causal line from one specific famine to one specific later persecution. But the broader pattern catastrophe followed by a search for anyone to hold responsible recurs with troubling regularity across this period of history, and it offers a sobering reminder that the human need to find a comprehensible cause for suffering when the true causes are diffuse and difficult to act against directly has sometimes led societies toward genuinely tragic conclusions. What emerges from all of these competing explanations, divine punishment, merchant greed, and the more nuanced modern understanding of compounding, structural and climatic pressures, is not really a matter of determining which single theory was correct, while the others were simply wrong. Each explanation examined honestly captures a piece of something real. The climate genuinely did shift catastrophically. Some merchants and officials genuinely did profit from scarcity, whether through deliberate hoarding or simply through the ordinary uncomfortable logic of supply and demand operating without any modern safety net to soften its effects on the poorest households. And the psychological need to find meaning, to locate the crisis within some framework larger than pure, random misfortune shaped how communities processed and remembered what they had endured, sometimes in ways that caused genuine additional harm to already vulnerable people within those same communities. It's worth carrying this complexity forward because the story of the Great Famine examined this closely resists the kind of simple single-cause narrative that makes for an easy telling. It was weather and it was human systems, it was genuine bad luck and it was in places genuine human failure and greed. Untangling exactly how much weight to give, each thread remains active ongoing work for historians and climate scientists working together across disciplines that until fairly recently rarely spoke to one another at all. And what that untangling reveals next, the actual lasting consequences, this catastrophe left etched into the population, the economy, and even the political structure of the regions it touched, carries this story into territory that reaches further and lasts longer than the famine years themselves. A population that loses between 5 and 12% of its people to a single sustained catastrophe does not simply mourn and move forward unchanged. It carries the wound forward into every structure that depends on human labor, human reproduction, and human trust, and the Great Famine's true cost only becomes fully visible when historians trace what happened in the years and even generations that followed it. The most immediate and measurable consequence appears in the labor market itself, and it produces a genuinely counterintuitive result that took economic historians considerable time to fully appreciate. A population sharply reduced by mass death might be expected to leave survivors uniformly worse off, but the actual demographic mathematics of the situation worked differently. With significantly fewer labourers available to work the land in the years immediately following the famine, and with agricultural land itself cruelly remaining just as available as before since fields do not vanish along with the farmers who once worked them, the basic economic relationship between labour supply and labour demand shifted meaningfully in favour of the surviving workers. Historical wage records from several affected regions in the years following the Great Famine show real wages for agricultural labourers rising noticeably, a direct consequence of landlords and estate holders suddenly needing to compete harder for a smaller available workforce. It is a strange and uncomfortable pattern to sit with the idea that catastrophic mass death could function however unintentionally and at however horrific a cost as a kind of brutal economic reset for those who survived it. Scholars studying this period are careful to note that this wage improvement was neither immediate nor universal, and it did not remotely offset the horror of the mortality that produced it, but the pattern itself is well documented, and would within a few decades echo again on a far larger scale, following an even more devastating demographic catastrophe that struck the same regions. Beyond wages, the famine left a measurable imprint on the very structure of rural landholding and settlement patterns across the affected regions. Some of the smallest, most marginal farming plots land that had only been brought under cultivation in the preceding generations to feed a growing population, pressing against the limits of good farmland, were abandoned entirely in the famine's aftermath. Their surviving occupants either dead or relocated to more viable holdings left vacant by neighbours who had not survived. Archaeological surveys in parts of England and the Low Countries have identified what researchers call deserted medieval settlements. Small hamlets and isolated farmsteads that appear based on pottery dating and other physical evidence to have been abandoned during or shortly after this period, their fields eventually reverting to pasture or scrub. Not every one of these abandoned sites can be definitively linked to the Great Famine specifically, since rural settlement patterns shifted for many overlapping reasons across the following century, and the evidence remains incomplete regarding precisely how many of these desertions trace directly to this crisis versus later pressures. But the broader pattern, marginal land being pushed back out of cultivation in the years following the famine, aligns closely with what economic logic would predict: a population no longer large enough to justify farming the least productive, most difficult ground it had been forced to rely on in more crowded times. There is a psychological and social dimension to the famine's legacy that proves considerably harder to measure than wages or settlement patterns, but that historians increasingly believe left just as lasting an imprint. Communities that live through sustained severe scarcity often develop what researchers studying famine across many different historical periods and cultures describe as a kind of institutional caution around food storage and reserve planning, sometimes persisting for generations beyond the individuals who actually experienced the original crisis firsthand. Several towns and monastic institutions in the regions affected by the Great Famine show documented increases in the size and formality of their grain reserve systems in the decades following the crisis, a shift toward more centralized, more carefully audited storage practices than had been typical before. Whether this reflects a genuinely rational, lasting institutional response to lived trauma, or simply reflects the personal caution of a specific generation of officials who had lived through the famine themselves and gradually faded as that generation was replaced by successors with no direct memory of the crisis, remains a point. Some historians debate. What does appear reasonably well supported across multiple regions is that this heightened caution, whatever its precise psychological or institutional origin, did not last infinitely. Several of the same regions that built more robust grain reserve systems in the immediate aftermath of the Great Famine would go on to experience serious, though generally less catastrophic, subsistence crises again within the following century, suggesting that institutional memory of even a genuinely horrific catastrophe has real limits, fading gradually as the direct witnesses to it pass away. The famine's consequences extended well beyond the purely economic and administrative, reaching into demographic patterns that would shape the affected regions for decades. Historical demographers studying parish and manorial records from the period note a measurable dip in birth rates during and immediately following the famine years, an entirely expected outcome given the severe physical toll malnutrition takes on human fertility, but one that carried its own compounding consequences forward. A smaller birth cohort born during or shortly after a major famine means quite simply a smaller working-age population roughly 2 decades later, a demographic echo that continued to shape labor availability and economic conditions in these regions long after the immediate crisis had technically ended. Some historians studying the broader trajectory of 14th century European demography have suggested that the population weakening and social strain left behind by the Great Famine may have left affected regions somewhat more vulnerable to the catastrophic epidemic that would sweep across the same territories roughly 3 decades later. Since populations already stressed by earlier nutritional hardship and social and economic systems already strained by the difficult recovery from famine, arguably had less resilience to absorb a second, even larger shock. This remains, it should be said honestly, a genuinely debated point among historians rather than a settled conclusion, since isolating the famine's specific contribution to later vulnerability from the many other factors influencing that later catastrophe is extraordinarily difficult given the limitations of surviving medieval records. But the timing and the logic of the argument have led a meaningful number of serious historians to take the connection seriously as at least a contributing factor, even if they stop short of calling it a proven direct cause. There is a quieter, more intimate consequence of the famine years worth pausing on as well, one that lived not in ledgers or settlement patterns, but in the accumulated practical knowledge passed down within individual families and communities. Households that survived the Great Famine, particularly those who had come closest to genuine starvation before finding some way through it, frequently appear in later regional folklore and oral tradition as sources of specific, detailed practical wisdom about famine foods, which wild plants could sustain a family in true desperation, how to stretch a diminished grain supply through careful rationing, which preservation shortcuts were worth the risk in a true emergency and which were not. This kind of knowledge, born from genuine suffering, often persisted in regional agricultural and culinary traditions for generations afterward, sometimes long outliving any clear memory of the specific crisis that had originally produced it. It raises a genuinely poignant question, doesn't it? How many small, seemingly ordinary rural food traditions that persisted in these regions for centuries afterward? A particular way of preparing a humble root vegetable, a specific method for stretching flour with other ground materials during a lean season, actually trace their origin back to the desperate improvisation of families trying to survive those 2 terrible years. The original crisis long forgotten, while the practical solution it produced quietly outlived it. The political consequences of the Great Famine, though harder to trace with precision than wage records or settlement archaeology, appear to have contributed to a broader pattern of tension between rural populations and the landowning and merchant classes that would surface repeatedly across the following decades in various forms of unrest and negotiation over labor conditions, rents, and food pricing. The experience of watching merchants profit, or being widely believed to profit, from scarcity during the famine years appears to have left a lasting residue of distrust in several regions, contributing to a broader climate of tension between labouring populations and those who controlled land and grain that would resurface in various forms of social conflict across the following century. Historians studying the longer arc of late medieval social history generally caution against drawing too direct or singular a line from the Great Famine, specifically to any one later episode of unrest, since so many overlapping economic and political pressures shaped this turbulent period. But most agree that the famine years represent a meaningful formative chapter in a longer story of shifting, often contentious relationships between those who worked the land and those who owned it. Relationships that the trauma and injustice, real or perceived, of the famine years help to further strain. What emerges from tracing all of these threads forward? The wages, the abandoned fields, the institutional caution that eventually faded, the demographic echo carried forward 2 decades, the quiet survival of practical knowledge in humble kitchen traditions, and the lasting residue of social distrust is a picture of a catastrophe whose true cost was never fully contained within the 2 years it actually lasted. The Great Famine functions in the honest accounting of history, less like a single sharp wound that eventually healed cleanly, and more like a stone dropped into still year, its ripples continuing to spread outward, growing fainter but never quite disappearing, touching wages and settlement patterns and birth rates and social trust in ways that the frightened people living through the actual crisis in 1315 could never have anticipated or measured for themselves. And this raises the final, perhaps most important thread still waiting in this story, because a catastrophe this severe revealing so starkly exactly how fragile the entire system of human food preservation truly was did not simply fade into memory and repeat itself unchanged for the next several centuries. Somewhere in the long, slow accumulation of human ingenuity that followed across kitchens and laboratories and battlefields still centuries away, the first genuine breakthroughs were quietly beginning to take shape, breakthroughs that would eventually do what salt smoke, cold and careful granary architecture alone had never fully been able to accomplish. Nearly 5 centuries after the Great Famine emptied the granaries of Northern Europe, an entirely different kind of hunger crisis was quietly reshaping the priorities of a nation locked in continuous warfare, and it would ultimately produce the breakthrough that had eluded human beings since the very first strip of meat was hung to dry above a fire. The nation was France, the era was the turbulent years following the Revolution, and the problem, in essence, had not changed at all in thousands of years. Armies moved faster and fought farther from home than ever before, and no preservation method available at the end of the 18th century could reliably keep an army fed across a long campaign without massive spoilage, disease, and waste trailing behind every advancing column. The scale of the problem had become genuinely staggering by this point in history. Military quartermasters supplying Napoleon's campaigns faced logistical challenges that dwarfed anything armies of earlier centuries had needed to solve, feeding forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands spread across battlefronts that stretched from Spain to Russia for months and sometimes years at a stretch. Salted meat remained heavy, prone to spoilage in humid conditions, and increasingly inadequate for the sheer scale of provisioning required. Reports from military physicians and quartermasters throughout this period describe widespread illness among soldiers linked directly to poor quality or spoiled rations, a problem that had in truth plagued every army in recorded history but had never before been treated as a solvable engineering problem rather than simply an unfortunate cost of war. In 1795, the French government, recognizing the severity of this challenge, announced a substantial cash prize, 12,000 francs, an enormous sum for the era to be awarded to anyone who could develop a genuinely effective method for preserving food suitable for provisioning the military. This was in its own right a remarkable historical moment, one of the first documented instances of a government treating the ancient, universal problem of food spoilage not as an unavoidable feature of existence to be managed through inherited tradition, but as a specific technical challenge that dedicated systematic experimentation might actually solve outright. The man who would eventually claim that prize was neither a scientist by formal training nor a nobleman with access to elite laboratories, but a Parisian confectioner and chef named Nicolas Appert, a man who had spent years working with food preparation in a professional kitchen and had developed through patient trial and observation an instinct for how heat and sealed containers interacted with food that would prove more valuable than any formal scientific credential. Appert began experimenting sometime in the 1790s, working through a long, painstaking process of trial and error that would eventually consume the better part of 14 years before he felt confident enough in his method to present it publicly. His approach remarkably achieved its goal without Appert ever understanding in any scientific sense why it actually worked. He discovered that if food was placed inside thick glass jars, sealed carefully with cork and wax, and then submerged in boiling water for a carefully calibrated length of time depending on the specific food involved, the contents would remain edible and safe for months, sometimes considerably longer without any of the salting, smoking, or drying that every previous preservation method had required. This was quite simply unlike anything that had come before it in the long history of food preservation. Salt, smoke, and cold had always changed food, altering its texture and flavour as the price of extending its life. Appert's method, by contrast, could preserve food in something remarkably close to its original state, still moist, still tender, sealed away from the world inside a simple glass container. What makes Appert's achievement so genuinely remarkable and worth sitting with for a moment is that he accomplished this entirely without any understanding of germ theory bacteria or the microbiological processes his method was actually defeating. The scientific explanation for why his technique worked, that heat destroys the microorganisms responsible for spoilage and that a properly sealed container prevents new contamination from entering afterward, would not be established for another 60 years, arriving only with the pioneering work of the chemist Louis Pasteur in the 1860s. Appert operated purely through empirical observation, careful record-keeping, and an enormous amount of patient repetition, adjusting his process again and again based on which jars spoiled and which did not, until he arrived at a reliable method through sheer disciplined trial rather than theoretical understanding. In 1810, having proven his method sufficiently to the satisfaction of a government commission, Appert received the prize that had been offered 15 years earlier, and published his findings in a book that laid out his complete process for anyone to use. There is a quiet, almost poetic irony worth pausing on here, because Appert's method essentially solved through careful practical engineering the exact same invisible danger that had haunted German farmhouse kitchens in the story of sausage poisoning explored earlier in this very history. The low-oxygen sealed environment that had once created perfect conditions for deadly bacterial toxins to form undetected inside cured meat was, in Appert's method, rendered safe by the crucial addition of thorough heat treatment before sealing, a step that destroyed the dangerous microorganisms before they ever had the chance to multiply inside their sealed container. Appert did not know this was what he had done. He simply knew through years of careful observation that this particular sequence of steps produced food that stayed safe, while variations on the process sometimes did not. It would take decades of accumulated scientific understanding for anyone to fully explain exactly why his intuition, refined through nothing but patient trial and error, had actually been correct all along. Appert's breakthrough travelled quickly once published, though it would undergo one more crucial transformation before becoming the technology we would actually recognize today. Within roughly a year of Appert's publication, an English merchant named Peter Durand patented a related concept, replacing Appert's fragile glass jars with a container made of tin-coated iron, a material sturdier, lighter, and far less prone to breakage during the rough handling of military transport and long sea voyages. This tin container, refined and improved over the following decades by the manufacturers across Britain and eventually the wider world, became the direct ancestor of the modern tin, and the technology that would go on to feed armies, sailors, and eventually entire civilian populations across the following 2 centuries. The scientific understanding that would eventually explain why both Appert and Durand's methods actually worked arrived, as mentioned, considerably later, through the work of Louis Pasteur, whose research into fermentation and spoilage during the 1850s and 1860s finally established with rigorous scientific proof that microorganisms invisible to the naked eye were the actual agents responsible for decay, and that controlled heating could reliably destroy them. Pasteur's work, originally undertaken to help French winemakers and brewers solve problems of unwanted fermentation in their products, ultimately provided the theoretical foundation that transformed food preservation from a craft refined through inherited intuition and patient trial into an actual applied science, one that could be studied, measured, and deliberately improved, rather than simply passed down through tradition and careful observation. It is worth noting how strange and humbling this sequence actually is when you consider it honestly. Appert solved the practical problem first entirely without understanding the underlying cause. Pasteur explained the cause decades later entirely separate from any direct connection to Appert's original work. Practical human ingenuity in this case genuinely outpaced scientific theory, rather than following obediently behind it. A pattern scholars studying the history of technology and science note recurs more often across history than most people assume. Though the precise relationship between practical innovation and theoretical scientific understanding across different technologies remains an area scholars continue to actively study and debate. The final major breakthrough in this long arc arrived through an entirely different pathway, mechanical rather than chemical, and it addressed a preservation principle humanity had understood intuitively since the construction of the Persian yak-chal centuries earlier. The simple, reliable power of cold but had never before been able to produce and control artificially on demand independent of season or geography. Mechanical refrigeration developed gradually across the 19th century through the work of numerous inventors and engineers working in parallel across different countries, building on earlier scientific understanding of how compressing and expanding certain gases could be used to move heat out of an enclosed space. Early mechanical refrigeration systems found their first major practical application not in household kitchens, which would come considerably later, but in the meatpacking and brewing industries, and perhaps most transformatively in the refrigerated shipping that began to develop in the latter decades of the 1800s, allowing meat, dairy, and produce to travel enormous distances across oceans without spoiling in a way that would have seemed almost like genuine magic to anyone living even a single century earlier. Consider what this actually meant for the ancient rhythm. This story has spent so much time exploring the desperate seasonal race between abundance and scarcity that had shaped human life since the first hunter-gatherer band learned to smoke meat above a fire. Refrigerated shipping meant that meat raised on the grassland of Argentina could arrive still fresh on the dinner tables in London, thousands of miles and many weeks removed from where the animal had actually lived. It meant that the specific location of food production and the specific location of food consumption tied together for the entire span of human history by the hard physical limits of how quickly perishable food decayed, could finally genuinely begin to separate from one another. The granary that had once needed to sit within walking distance of the fields that filled it, the smoking rack that needed to stand beside the river, where the fish were actually caught. These ancient physical constraints, unbroken since the earliest days of human settlement, were finally quietly coming undone. None of this arrived instantly, and it is worth resisting the temptation to imagine this transformation as some single dramatic turning point rather than the slow, uneven process it actually was. Canning technology took decades to spread from military and naval provisioning into ordinary civilian households, hampered initially by expense, by occasional early manufacturing defects that led to genuine contamination scares, and simply by the slow, generational process through which any genuinely new technology gradually earns public trust. Mechanical refrigeration for ordinary homes would not become widely accessible until well into the 20th century, meaning that for most families across most of the 19th century, the ancient preservation techniques this story began with salting, smoking, drying, and careful seasonal planning remain the primary tools available for keeping a household fed, even as the first genuine alternatives were quietly slowly taking shape in laboratories, shipping yards, and canning factories not so very far away. What strikes historians studying this transition most when they step back and view it across its full span is how directly this entire chain of breakthroughs traces back to warfare and desperation rather than leisurely scientific curiosity. Appert's prize existed because an army needed feeding across battlefields spanning a continent. The tin can spread rapidly in part because of its usefulness to naval and military provisioning. Even Pasteur's foundational scientific work, though undertaken initially to solve problems in wine and beer production, would go on to inform public health and food safety practices that reshaped how entire nations understood the relationship between invisible microorganisms and human illness more broadly. The single ancient problem this story has traced from its earliest hunter-gatherer origins through medieval famine and into modern science. The simple, stubborn fact that food does not want to remain food finally began to yield, not through some single moment of pure inspiration, but through the same slow accumulated combination of desperation, patient observation, and hard-won practical experimentation that had characterized every previous human attempt to solve it, stretching all the way back to that woman working reindeer and meat over a smoking fire at the mouth of an Ice Age cave. It leaves something worth carrying forward into the quiet space still remaining in this story, a sense of just how recent, how genuinely new, in the full span of human history, our current relief from this ancient danger actually is. For the overwhelming majority of the time human beings have existed on this earth, the fear that shaped this entire story, the fear of the granary running empty, the fear of the meat turning. Before winter arrived, the fear that clever hands and careful tradition might still not be enough was simply the ordinary, unremarkable backdrop of daily life. It is only in the smallest, most recent sliver of that long history that this fear has genuinely begun to recede. And understanding exactly what that shift actually cost and what it still quietly means for how we live now is where this long story is finally ready to come to rest. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over an excavated storage pit once the archaeologists have finished their work for the day, packed away their brushes and their careful little bags of soil samples, and left the site to the evening light. It is not an empty silence. It is a silence full of everything. This story has spent so many hours trying to hold the woman working reindeer meat over a smoking fire at the edge of an Ice Age forest. The child in the Jordan Valley, growing up beside one of the first granaries humanity ever built, the merchant in Flanders, writing anxious letters about spoiled grain shipments. The frightened chronicler in England trying to find the words for what he was watching his neighbours endure. All of it settles into ground like this eventually. All of it waits quietly to be understood. What this story has really been about underneath the salt and the smoke and the granaries and the terrible arithmetic of famine is something simpler and considerably harder to look at directly, which is how thin the line has always been between a well-fed people and a starving one. For nearly the entire span of human existence, that line was measured, not in abstractions, but in days in a handful of dry weeks needed to cure a season's meat, in a granary roof that either held or did not, in whether the rain came at exactly the wrong moment during a single critical harvest. Civilizations rose and organized themselves and built entire systems of law and hierarchy and religious devotion around the single unglamorous problem of keeping food edible long enough to matter. And when that system failed even briefly, even in a single bad decade, the consequences reached into everything, into wages and settlement patterns and birth rates, and who a frightened population chose to blame when the harvest simply would not come. It would be easy looking back from where we sit now to tell this story as one of simple, steady progress, primitive fear, slowly giving way to modern comfort, ignorance, yielding to science danger, receding neatly into safety. But that was never quite how it happened, and this story has tried throughout to resist that easier and less honest telling. Progress here did not arrive as a straight line. It arrived in fits and false starts, in inherited wisdom passed down through grief, long before anyone understood the science behind it, in a confectioner, spending 14 patient years solving a problem, He never fully understood, even after he had solved it in a scientist decades later, finally explaining almost as an afterthought to his work with wine why that confectioner's method had worked all along. Human beings did not conquer the problem of spoilage through some single moment of brilliant insight. They wore it down, slowly generation after generation, through an accumulation of failure, careful observation, hard-won intuition, and a stubborn refusal to simply accept that hunger was owed. And perhaps that is the deepest pattern running underneath everything this story has touched, the pattern that connects a woman drying meat above an ice age fire to a French chemist peering through a microscope at something no human eye had ever properly seen before. Ordinary people faced with an enemy they could not see and rarely fully understood kept trying anyway. They buried grain in clay-lined pits without knowing precisely why it helped. They pricked sausages with needles for reasons rooted more in inherited caution than in chemistry. They built granaries 11,000 years ago before they had even finished building comparable homes for themselves, because keeping the harvest safe mattered more than almost anything else they could imagine. This is not a story about a small number of brilliant individuals rescuing humanity from an ancient danger. It is a story about an enormous, largely uncredited inheritance of ordinary human patience refined endlessly across countless generations who left behind no name we remember, and who nonetheless made every later breakthrough, every jar, Appert ever sealed, every discovery Pasteur ever made quietly possible. There is one final piece of evidence worth holding on to before we let this story rest, because it captures something the rest of this history has been circling around from the very beginning. In a museum collection in France sits one of Nicolas Appert's original sealed jars, a piece of preserved food dating back to the earliest years of his experimentation in the very first decade of the 1800s. It has been examined carefully and respectfully by modern researchers curious about exactly how well his method actually held up across the better part of 2 centuries. And in at least some of these surviving examples, the seal has remained intact long enough that the contents inside, still recognizable, still essentially preserved in something close to their original state, have outlasted the empire. Appert made them for outlasted the monarchy that briefly followed it, outlasted every government France would go on to have across the next 200 years. A humble jar of preserved food sealed by a chef who never understood the microbiology behind his own success has quietly endured longer than the nations built to feed it. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that a small unglamorous object succeeding in its own patient and undramatic way at exactly the task that had eluded and haunted human beings since the very first meal was ever left sitting too long in open air. It is worth remembering gently as this story comes to its close how recent our own relief from this ancient fear truly is. Somewhere not very far back at all, if you measure it against the true length of human history, there lived a great-grandmother, perhaps your own, who understood the specific worry of a root cellar running low in late February, who knew exactly how many jars needed to last until the garden came back in, who carried whether she ever spoke of it aloud or not, some quiet inherited echo of every winter that came before hers, all the way back to a granary in the Jordan Valley, and a woman working meat over a fire at the edge of a retreating ice sheet. That fear so ordinary and so constant across nearly the entire span of human existence has only recently, and only for some of the world's population even now, begun to loosen its hold. Let the rhythm slow now. Think of the woman at the cave mouth once more working her reindeer meat in the fading autumn light. She does not know she will become part of a story told this far into the future. She only knows the fire needs tending and the strips need turning and the winter is coming whether she is ready or not. She turns the meat anyway. Think of the granary keeper in the Jordan Valley, closing a wooden door on a season's harvest, trusting walls and clay and careful hands to hold back a hunger that has haunted every generation before this one, and closes the door anyway. Think of Nicholas Appert alone in a Paris kitchen sealing jar after jar for the 14th year in a row, with no certainty that any of it will work, no understanding yet of what he's actually defeating, and seals the jar anyway. This is the through line, quiet and unbroken running, beneath every century this story has crossed. Not certainty, never certainty, just the steady, unglamorous choice to keep trying to keep preserving, to keep believing that tomorrow's hunger could somehow be answered by today's careful work. Outside your window now, wherever you are listening from, there is very likely a small machine humming quietly in your kitchen, keeping food safe without asking anything of you at all. It rarely occurs to anyone to be grateful for it. It has no fire to tend, no salt to measure, no granary door to close against the coming dark. But somewhere behind that quiet hum stands an unbroken line of hands reaching back through frightened chroniclers and desperate famine years, through granary keepers and ice age hunters, through a chef who sealed his hope into glass jars without knowing why it worked, all of them working in their own time against the same ancient enemy. The fire is still burning somewhere far behind us now. The meat still turns slowly above it. And for the first time in the whole long history of our species, most of us can finally sleep without listening for whether it does.